one of the greatest presidents the world and the Americas have ever seen. He was the country's greatest moral, cultural, constitutional, and political leader in times of the severe crisis of the American Civil War. He succeeded in preserving the Union, abolishing slavery, bolstering the federal government, and modernizing the US economy. Hello and welcome to UPSC History View. Today, let's learn about Abraham Lincoln. Let's learn about the early political career of Abraham Lincoln. When Lincoln first entered politics, Andrew Jackson was president. Lincoln shared the sympathies that the Jacksonians professed for the common man, but he disagreed with the Jacksonian view that the government should be divorced from economic enterprise. The legitimate object of government, he was later to say, is to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done, but cannot do at all or cannot do so well for themselves in their separate and individual capacities. Among the prominent politicians of his time, he most admired Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. Clay and Webster advocated using the powers of the federal government to encourage business and develop the country's resources by means of a national bank, a protective tariff, and a program of internal improvements for facilitating transportation. In Lincoln's view, Illinois and the West as a whole desperately needed such aid for economic development. From the outset, he associated himself with the party of Clay and Webster, the Whigs. As a Whig member of the Illinois state legislature, to which he was elected 4 times from 1834 to 1840, Lincoln devoted himself to a grandiose project for constructing with state funds a network of railroads, highways, and canals. Whigs and Democrats joined in passing an omnibus bill for these undertakings, but the Panic of 1837 and the ensuing business depression brought about the abandonment of most of them. While in the legislature, he demonstrated that, though opposed to slavery, he was no abolitionist. In 1837, in response to the mob murder of Elijah Lovejoy, an anti-slavery newspaperman of Alton, the legislature introduced resolutions condemning abolitionist societies and defending slavery in the southern states as sacred by virtue of the federal constitution. Lincoln refused to vote for the resolutions. Together with a fellow member, he drew up a protest that declared, on the one hand, that slavery was founded on both injustice and bad policy, and on the other, that the promulgation of abolition doctrines tends rather to increase than to abate its evils. During his single term in Congress, 1847-49, Abraham Lincoln, as a lone Whig from Illinois, gave little attention to legislative matters. He proposed a bill for the gradual and compensated emancipation of enslaved people in the District of Columbia. But because it was to take effect only with the approval of the free white citizens of the district, it displeased abolitionists as well as slaveholders and never was seriously considered. Lincoln devoted much of his time to presidential politics, to unmaking one president a Democrat and making another a Whig. Abraham Lincoln found an issue and a candidate in the Mexican War. With his spot resolutions, he challenged the statement of President James K. Polk that Mexico had started the war by shedding American blood upon American soil. Along with other members of his party, Lincoln voted to condemn Polk and the war while also voting for supplies to carry it on. At the same time, he labored for the nomination and election of the war hero Zachary Taylor. After Taylor's success at the polls, Lincoln expected to be named Commissioner of the General Land Office as a reward for his campaign services, and he was bitterly disappointed when he failed to get the job. Abraham Lincoln's criticisms of the war, meanwhile, had not been popular among the voters in his own congressional district. At the age of 40, frustrated in politics, he seemed to be at the end of his public career. Let's learn about Abraham Lincoln's road to presidency. For about 5 years, Lincoln took little part in politics, and then a new sectional crisis gave him a chance to re-emerge and rise to statesmanship. In 1854, his political rival Stephen A. Douglas maneuvered through Congress a bill for reopening the entire Louisiana Purchase to slavery and allowing the settlers of Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether to permit slaveholding in those territories. The Kansas-Nebraska Act provoked violent opposition in Illinois and the other states of the Old Northwest. It gave rise to the Republican Party while speeding the Whig Party on its way to disintegration. Along with many thousands of other homeless Whigs, Lincoln soon became a Republican in 1856. Before long, some prominent Republicans in the East talked of attracting Douglas to the Republican fold, and with him his Democratic following in the West. Lincoln would have none of it. He was determined that he, not Douglas, should be the Republican leader of his state and section. Lincoln challenged the incumbent Douglas for the Senate seat in 1858, and the series of debates they engaged in throughout Illinois was political oratory of the highest order. Both men were shrewd debaters and accomplished stump speakers, though they could hardly have been more different in style and appearance. The short and pudgy Douglas, whose stentorian voice and graceful gestures swayed audiences, and the tall, homely, almost emaciated-looking Lincoln, who moved awkwardly and whose voice was piercing and shrill. Lincoln's prose and speeches, however, were eloquent, pithy, powerful, and free of the verbosity so common in communication of his day. The debates were published in 1860, together with a biography of Lincoln in a best-selling book that Lincoln himself compiled and marketed as part of his campaign. In their basic views, Lincoln and Douglas were not as far apart as they seemed in the heat of political argument. Neither was abolitionist or pro-slavery. But Lincoln, unlike Douglas, insisted that Congress must exclude slavery from the territories. He disagreed with Douglas's belief that the territories were by nature unsuited to the slavery-based economy and that no congressional legislation was needed to prevent the spread of slavery into them. In one of his most famous speeches, Abraham Lincoln said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe the government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." Abraham Lincoln predicted that the country eventually would become all one thing or all the other. Again and again he insisted that the civil liberties of every US citizen, white as well as black, were at stake. The territories must be kept free, he further said, because new free states were places for poor people to go and better their condition. He agreed with Thomas Jefferson and other founding fathers, however, that slavery should be merely contained, not directly attacked. In fact, when it was politically expedient to do so, Abraham Lincoln reassured his audiences that he did not endorse citizenship for blacks or believe in the equality of the races. "I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races," he told a crowd in Charleston, Illinois. "I am not, nor ever have been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, not to intermarry with white people. There is," he added, "a physical difference between the white and black races which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality." Lincoln drove home the inconsistency between Douglas's popular sovereignty principle and the Dred Scott decision of 1857, in which the US Supreme Court held that Congress could not constitutionally exclude slavery from the territories. In the end, Lincoln lost the election to Douglas. Although the outcome did not surprise him, it depressed him deeply. Lincoln had, nevertheless, gained national recognition and soon began to be mentioned as a presidential prospect for 1860. On May 18, 1860, after Lincoln and his friends had made skillful preparations, He was nominated on the third ballot at the Republican National Convention in Chicago. He then put aside his law practice and, though making no stump speeches, gave full time to the direction of his campaign. His main object, he had written, was to hedge against divisions in the Republican ranks, and he counseled party workers to say nothing on points where it is probable we shall disagree. With the Republicans united, the Democrats divided, and a total of 4 candidates in the field, Lincoln carried the election on November 6th. Although he received no votes from the Deep South and no more than 40 out of 100 in the country as a whole, the popular votes were so distributed that Lincoln won a clear and decisive majority in the Electoral College. Thank you for listening to this discussion on the early political career of Abraham Lincoln. For more such discussions, get the UPSC Practice app from the App Store and visit upscpractice.com.